Well, first, it really is a pleasure to be back in Mexico. It was a long time since I was here, but it's particularly so to be part of Philip's inauguration into the Academy. And it just gives me enormous pleasure, one, to be here, and the fact that it actually happened. What I thought I would do is just talk about a few things that I've been involved in over the years. The first thing is really a very old, quite an old thing. The middle part is, a touch depressing, and that's more recent. And the last thing, talking about marriage and divorce prediction, is equally depressing. But okay, so let me, if this works okay. Okay, and let me see if this will work. That's Philip Maney. And Philip has been involved in so many different things, and his connection really, just one of the many connections with UNAM is working on the fish that you saw on the poster. Because there's another thing that Philip's been interested in, all sorts of animal markings. And with this mouse, I mean, it's got stripes. And then there was this picture of Philip. And so you think, well, it was just a joke. Not really, because Philip published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science on how the mouse got its stripes. I know how the mouse got its stripes. It was an old pencil I had. Anyway, I'm going to talk about leopards, but the talk about mathematicians in the biological world, they've had a bad press. And St. Augustine, really, what he said was, beware of mathematicians and all those who make false prophecies. And that they don't sort of bound your soul in the depths of hell. I thought it was a little extreme, but there is quite a strong feeling that mathematics is for mathematicians, and a lot of it is. And so what I want to do is just describe a few practical things where the mathematics is really fairly elementary. And the first thing I want to talk about is really animal coat patterns. And this is something I got involved in a very long time ago. And it came about reading to our daughter the Just So stories about how the leopard gets its spots. And so I said, I'll ask one of my colleagues in college. And nobody knew. And I'm not sure I think we still don't know. Anyway, what I wanted to try was to just take a model, not, as Philip said this morning, not that I think this is the mechanism that causes the spots, but that there may be some kind of principles that one can get out of something like this. This is the kind of the classical reaction diffusion equation. And this actually is the system that I used, and it was the first experimental reaction diffusion system that I'd ever heard of, and it was by Daniel Tumours in the University of Compiègne. And so what I did is I took this mechanism and I thought, well, when do marks start in animals? It must be sometime early in the embryonic stage. And so I thought I'd take a few shapes, and that's just another nice picture of a cheetah taken by a friend. And so what I thought I would do is just describe what I did really a long, long time ago. And my computing skills are such that when I did this computing on tapered cylinders, it was when I was visiting Utah, and I wrote the program. I felt unbelievably superior at the time. I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, went into the university on Sunday, then I had the computer all to myself. And after that time, I vowed I'd never ever do any numerical analysis again. And so all my students have always done numerical analysis. And so, but when I did this, it was noticing that a lot of spotted animals had striped tails. And so I took these shapes and computed the solutions with parameters that give spatial patterns. And this sort of came out that somehow you couldn't have stripes and then spots. It had to be the other way around. And I thought I'd show this cat because the biologists will know what a developmental constraint is in development. I mean, for example, you know, when the arm grows, we don't have 5 bones going down to 2. So there's some kind of developmental constraint. And so in this, the constraint is that this spotted animal will have striped extremities. And Geoffrey Zontillaire wrote a book around about 1836, and he was the first person, I think, that mentioned developmental constraints. And so I thought I'd show the cat that was called after him. That's just another nice picture of a cheetah that exemplifies that kind of, if I were a mathematician, I'd call it an axiom, but I'd lose a lot of friends. And this work was then, a lot of it was extended by colleagues here, including Faustino and Raphael and Philip, and they looked at problems associated with tubes growing. If one now looks at scale, and this was the other thing, I took these shapes and I thought, what sort of patterns can you generate? And it turned out that if it was too small, you couldn't generate any pattern. It was just uniform in color. And then, as the domain got bigger, you started to get first bifurcations. And the scale difference between that one and this one is roughly about 1,000. And so this is an example of the second bifurcation. These goats are quite common. There's quite a lot in France. This is a picture of the next bifurcation, which are cows that really come from where I grew up in Scotland. And they're called Galloway cows. And this is the typical scenery of round about where I grew up and left a long time ago. That's just a nice, fun picture of an anteater. But so the thing about this business of scale, it does seem to, there's something in it, but as I said, I don't know how the pattern is really, what the chemistry is. Okay, so if one now looks at the other extreme, then as the animals get bigger and bigger, I think just intuitively what it's saying is the boundary conditions are so far away that in effect there are no boundaries. And so therefore in the middle you'll start to get very little pattern. And so the giraffes are really the kind of among the largest animals that start to have pattern. And there are 2 kinds of giraffes, these kind, and of course one can actually get these sort of patterns from the model. If it's very big, I mean, one can think an elephant's got no marks, neither has a rhino, but then I thought you don't see a mammoth very often. And so, but without any question, everybody who draws mammoths never gives them spots. So there must be some evolutionary genetic inherited thing that big animals don't have spots. Anyway, let me look at striped animals. The thing about is in the embryo, and in the case of the alligator, we know exactly when all these stripes are formed. I'm not going to talk about alligators, but there are quite a lot of experiments that were done based on some of the modeling that was done by Mark Ferguson in Manchester. But if you look at, if the marks start there, then with growth, you start to get this equizebra. On the other hand, if the stripes go on slightly later, then you end up with the other kind of zebra. And what is really, if one then looks at the leg, of course the marks always I think the only thing that came out about it biologically was the initial conditions are totally unique. Minute differences, and so every animal is going to have its own pattern. But if you look at this, you've got a thin region where it's all stripes, and then you've got stripes. When you compute it, you get really the sort of thing that you start to observe in the zebra. These were taken by Dan Rubenstein in my department in Princeton, and he works on the survival of these zebras. These ones are really starting to die out because they can't adapt to the environmental changes, whereas the other zebras, these ones, seem to be are doing quite well. And that's just I thought, just a nice picture. Okay, the thing about animal markings is occasionally there are aberrations. And this, the man who really observed this in Zimbabwe way back in 1927 thought he had discovered a new species, and he gave it a name. He really, this was his, his path to fame. This actually is a recent picture that was taken actually in South Africa in the Kruger National Park, that there are these occasional aberrations. And I think one of the interesting ones is this zebra sheep in Australia. The reason I heard about this is somebody who came to work with me from Brisbane. This was somebody he had gone to school with. And he got this zebra sheep, and he was offered astronomical sums for just the skin of this sheep. He tried for ages to try and reproduce it, but as far as I know, it's the only striped zebra sheep. Then, of course, there are the zebras. That, and this poor zebra, it knew it was different, and it kind of went to the outside, and it was kind of ostracized. And one of the surprising things when I first found this, giving a talk in Paris, and there were a lot of people from North Africa. So out of curiosity, I said, well, how many of you think a zebra is a white animal with black stripes? People put up their hands. And I said, how about a black animal with white stripes? And a whole lot of people put up their hands. The white people voted for the first one, and the black people voted for the second one. It was just one of these ridiculous things. Okay, let me move on to brain tumors that I got involved in, and these are, as I said, they're called gliomas or glioblastomas. They are grade 4 tumors. They are absolutely awful. Everybody dies. It's just, there is no survival of these. And so what I want to do is I would like to describe a model that really links modeling with clinical research. Now, of course, it's a very complicated thing why you get a brain tumor or why you get any tumor. And the geneticists will say it's all genes. And as somebody once said, when genetics is a finished subject, we won't know how to build a chicken. And in a sense, that sums up a lot of the problems with genetics, which is unbelievably important, but it doesn't actually do the mechanism. They can control the mechanisms, but they don't tell you what the mechanism is. And so in this case, since we don't know really what causes them, what we wanted to do was we wanted to enhance imaging techniques. We also wanted to really show how inadequate, apologies to all the imaging, Raphael here, but there is a problem with imaging. It is just totally inadequate. And I'm then going to, the other thing is to determine when tumors started. That's another thing. I then wanted to show this skull. People have been doing trepanations where they scrape the skull to get down into the brain to see if they can see what's causing whatever it is, the headaches or whatever. And this skull, this person had 4 healed trepanations. And so when one thinks of somebody scraping, and it was a scraper, you know, it really is, I thought it was just a dramatic picture. Just before I start describing the model, one of the people that I came across in France was Henri de Mondeville, who was probably the major surgeon of that period. And he was a great realist, but he had a very low opinion of the medical world. And he wrote a book, roughly between 1306 and 1316, and it was what he said about surgeons. And so he said, excuse my Spanish, it's probably not very good, but he called them illiterates. Then, he wasn't finished. He then called them vagabonds, etc. And then he went on about the English for those who don't read Spanish. And then it was the last one that I had problems with. They were brothel keepers. And anyway, he was just a man of his times. I mean, you know, he had ways of re-establishing virginity. I mean, he really was just, but he was immensely influential, and it was really from his book that people then started to think about surgery in a totally different way. And so, let me just show how one detects these. When somebody has a brain tumor, usually they have what's called a kind of like a partial seizure, or they suddenly are walking along and then they fall, or they suddenly lose speech for a while. And so they then go and they will have a CAT scan, a computer tomography CAT scan, of which there are various kinds. What these scans do is they can detect tumors. And they can't only detect what kind it is, but there are different kinds. This magnetic resonance imaging have different kinds, and the two there are, this one is much more accurate, you can see more of it, it's just much more expensive. So what they do is they take pictures of slices, usually maybe a millimeter all the way down the head. And then what they find is, you find if this is the tumor, and this is the necrotic center, this is what that one can see, and that one is what that one can see. So let me talk about the model. And of course, it's so complicated, and it's like one lecture a very, very long time ago by an ecologist who he said he was going to model fish and everything in the sea. And he says, and it's got 40,000 parameters. And everybody kind of gasped. He said, no, don't worry about it. I've been able to reduce it to 20,000. And so, in this case, I'd like to start at the other extreme. And so if you think, what are the basic things about the growth of a tumor? Well, if you go to a place in the brain, then the rate of change of the cancer cells is going to be equal to those that diffuse in and the multiplication. And this is just a simple equation that it's just saying in mathematical shorthand term what I've said in words. It does kind of quantify it. This is the diffusion coefficient that varies whether it's gray matter or white matter. This is the reproduction rate. And so if you take, I think it's log 2 over rho, then you get the turnover time. And for these kind of brain tumors, it's usually about 60 days. And then the mathematicians in the group will say, that's a ridiculous equation because it means that the cancer cells are going to grow exponentially. So it's a terrible model. One of the things that I learned working with medical people is they don't want to get emotionally involved. And so Buster Alvor, the neuropathologist, he then said, I said, you know, if I just do that, it's going to grow exponentially. He said, no, you don't have to worry. The patients are dead long before that. And so Anyway, so these are just the definitions of the diffusion. It's in grey matter, it's slower than in white matter. And this is the tumour cell density, the motility, the growth rate, and X is just where it is in the brain. And so, if you take, what one does is, of course, the tumour is very complex. And so what we did, and still do, is we take these CAT scans, and what you do is you produce an image of the tumour that is incredibly complex with things growing all over the place depending where in the brain, grey matter or white matter. And what we do is we work out the volume. Then, because we take that volume and make it into an equivalent sphere of radius r. And you say, well, one's losing all the medicine. Turns out one's not, but one's starting to get some idea of what's happening. And so if you take the radially symmetric equation, it's a linear equation, and you can write down the exact solutions. When I was about your stage, I went to an international congress in Amsterdam. And at that time, those of you who are mathematicians will know about asymptotic analysis and singular perturbation. And this person who really was one of the major people in it came from Russia. And at the end of the lecture, somebody said to him, what about linear equations? And he said, linear equations are for women. And the whole place just accepted this. Now he would be pilloried, of course. But anyway, you can write down the solution, and there it is. And this n is the number of cells that the tumour starts. And we don't know how many cells there are. One thinks it'll be one cancer cell. But of course, if it's one, maybe the surrounding tissue can actually kill it. And so when you ask people how many cells start a tumour, I remember somebody said to me, well, probably it could be 4,000. I said, what? He said, well, maybe 8,000. They have no idea. And so that is one of the unknowns about it. And so what we've got is the solution. Now, mathematicians, one can take this solution and you say, well, what happens as the tumour gets bigger and bigger? Well, in fact, if you let C1, this is a concentration that's the smallest density that the most sophisticated imaging technique can detect. And once again, it depends where it is in the brain, etc., lots of things. But basically, if you take the average brain tumour that is detected and make it into a sphere, it's got a radius of about 15 millimeters. And so if one takes that as the start of it, then when you take the solution and you say, well, what happens after it grows out? You find, in fact, that the diameter of this radial tumour grows linearly. It grows linearly with time and proportional to the square root of the multiplication times the diffusion. This is just a classical analytical solution. There's no sophistication in it. And so the velocity of the tumour, it actually grows at a constant rate. And it's like what Philip was saying this morning, in fact, Benjamin Rush was one of the rebels who signed the Declaration of Independence in America. And he said, mere speculation is totally irrelevant. And so here we had something that says it grows linearly with time, so we had to look at the data. And if you look at the data, that's low-grade tumours. And you then might say, but I've only got one example of a high-grade tumour. The reason there's only one high-grade tumour is anybody who has a tumour like this and has a biopsy, they go to the medical people and they want something done. And one close friend got, whom a lot of you actually will know, got a brain tumour, and he wrote to say, I know what you think, but he says, my family are wanting me to do something. So he ended up having surgery, which was an absolute disaster, as it almost always is. And so having data of a lot of glioblastomas is very difficult. And so this is one example of an untreated brain tumor. And this was the diagnosis. And this was actually post-mortem. And if one looks at the different parts, this is the model where these lines denote concentration in a real brain, not the spherical one, the real brain. And these are different concentrations getting less. This was what happened at autopsy. And this was a scan that was an MRI scan post-mortem. And this was done in September 2001. So one's starting to get a feel that maybe this kind of simple model is telling us something. This is an example. This is where it's diagnosis, which is, as I said, roughly a sphere of 15 millimeters. This is the size of it when the patient dies. And you can see that the cancer, the tumor is all over the place. There's just no way of seeing it. And you don't know where it is. And in fact, this is just it's a kind of old movie of this is an example. We just took typical parameters of a patient, and this shows how, now, what you're seeing, until you see, you still can't see the tumor in any MRI. And it's just about now, you will then start to see the black thing, the region. That's what the most sophisticated scanning can actually see. So one can see what the problem is. You know, one can see the problem for the neurosurgeon. But of course, neurosurgeons are not the most intelligent medical people in the world. All they want to do is surgery. And
there are some neurosurgeons in the audience.
well, I hope they're listening. I said to one, gave a talk to a bunch of medical, and I said, why on earth do you do surgery when you know it's a total waste of time and it can be a disaster? He said, if I don't do it, somebody else will. And this sort of cynicism, well, I've all sorts of medical stories, which accounts for my extreme skepticism. Okay, and this was an example. Resection is what they call surgical removal of the tumor. And this is actually quite old. It's old data done by Kreth. And what he did is he took 57 patients and did surgery, and they lived for 39 weeks afterwards. 58 other patients didn't have surgery, and they lived for 32 weeks. So one of the questions that one would like to answer is, why do some patients live longer than others? And you'll say, they've got different parameters. But how does that, in a sense, reflect back into what you do about surgery, or radiation for that matter? Okay, so can we suggest why it's no good? Well, what one can do, and this is why it is now used medically in really 2 of the hospitals in Seattle, is that one can actually do virtual treatment for a patient based on their parameters before you even try it. And so this is maybe one of the most useful things about it. So if one looks at a typical brain scan, and this is what a neurosurgeon will see and what he has to deal with. And so what they do is, a simplistic way, is they say, well, we're going to cut out here and, we'll get it all. And then, of course, 3 months, 4 months later, it starts to regrow. And then they said, but one of the mysteries about regrowing glioblastomas is it is multifocal. So in other words, you'll find there's a tumor here, it's a bit here, and it's all over the place. Well, if you actually look at it from the modeling point of view, this is what the neurosurgeon cuts out, and this is where the tumor has got to. There's absolutely no way he could get it all. Not only that, when the tumor regrows, this is what the scans show, and of course that's really, it's a bit dull, but this is what the mathematical model shows, that the tumor is all over the place. Of course it's going to be multifocal, because he's missed a lot of it. Well, he's missed most of it. And so really one gets an idea of the limitations of a lot of the treatment. So if you let that, what I said before, the smallest detectable one, the thing is, when does a tumor start? Maybe if I were an evangelist, well, let me just go on and pretend I'm an evangelist. If you use a cell phone, and if you look at the fine print with cell phones, what it says is there is no evidence that this is causing any problem. A friend in France, a botanist, conducted an experiment in which he had a plant starting to grow, and he subjected it with a cell phone for 2 hours, and then they really studied the growth of the plant, and it was deformed as a result of this 2-hour deformation by a cell phone. And the cell phone makers now are starting to get a little worried. And if you read the fine print again, they absolve themselves. And there was recent evidence that came out the middle of last year, which showed that when children used a cell phone, there was an increase in glucose in the brain. And so I just think you should not put it to your ear. I mean, I know this won't have any effect. Our grandchildren said, yeah, and then they go. But if you can use it without putting it to your ear, one should think of the Curie husband and wife, where he carried radioactive stuff in his waistcoat pocket, and they both died of cancer from radiation. Cell phones, I think, are potentially dangerous. And it's just, okay, I'm finished with that, but anyway. And so the reason I wanted to look at this was there will inevitably be a cancer trial for brain tumors. I don't know when it'll be, 5, 10 years, whenever, down the line. So the question that people are going to ask is, when did the tumor start? And of course, that's really very difficult because there are no symptoms until it gets to about 15 centimeters. And so, but then if you actually take the solution of the equation and switch it around, and then you say, well, if it's detected at 15 millimeters, or whatever size it is when it's detected by the MRI, then what you do is you just take this and you solve it for the time t, which is how long the tumor's been going. And so what you get is an estimate of when the tumor started based on the two parameters, which are rho and d, which are determined from 2 CAT scans of a patient. And so what you can do is you just take that and you can plot it. And one of the surprising things that what surprised me is if you look at these, this is 2 millimeters squared per month, and this is 10 millimeters squared per month. There's very little difference. So diffusion, when it's large, didn't make a big difference. And so if one knows when the tumor possibly started, one might be able to determine maybe it was an accident, who knows what it is, but it was just a bit of information that was useful. Well, it turns out, if you look at the equation and do just a little bit of asymptotic analysis, you can find that really the width of it is roughly this, and this is the gradient, how steep it is. And so these are just the 2 parameters. And so if you now look at, you get a qualitative and a quantitative view of why some tumors are easier to treat for longer. And in this case, this one is actually one where the diffusion coefficient is small and the reproduction is small. So that means it's much narrower. So that means when they actually, these neurosurgeons cut it out, if they cut out a little bit more, they get most of the tumor. They won't get it all, of course, but they get most of it. On the other hand, if you take a higher diffusion, then it's spread all the way out. And so this is a kind of mystery to the neurosurgeons, is here these people come in, this is the size of the tumor that we can see. Why do some of them live longer than others? It's not a very sophisticated thing. The analysis is really fairly simple. So really, what one's got are, everybody thought these things are unpredictable. I don't think they're unpredictable. And neither do all people I work with. It's a different way of studying tumors. Not only that, the time the tumor started, just what I talked about. The other thing is that we can quantify the growth of the tumor, where in the brain, gray matter, white matter, and put in timescales with it. We can then get a quantifiable explanation of patient survival. Not only that, you can, as I said before, you can test the efficacy of treatment before the patient undergoes these really quite horrifying treatments. We're now getting data. There's quite a lot of data being gathered, and with a colleague, Kristen Swanson, who did a PhD with me, and she's now very involved in the medical side. I thought I'd just finish this with another quote of Henri de Mondeville. I mean, and I said that surgery is a science and an art, and it's more exact, it's much more it's more preferable, it's more noble, more perfect, more necessary, and more lucrative. That really sums out how they feel now. I mean, he was a great realist. He was really very funny. Okay, let me talk about marriage. I've got about 10 minutes, 50, yeah. The person, when I retired from Oxford and went to Washington, it was to try and set up some mathematical biology groups. And at that time, this clinical psychology, John Gottman, wrote to me when I was still in Oxford to see if I'd give a talk. And then I got the letter when I was actually in Seattle. And he said he wondered if I could make a model of interaction between a couple. And I said, that's totally ridiculous. And he said, well, we'll have lunch together. I thought, yeah, sure. By the end of the lunch, I was hooked. And so what I did with just a habit with my graduate students, I like to get them involved in something other than just a thesis. And so this is a bunch of them, of students who came along, and we had some sessions, and we talked and everything. This is just something from the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and it's a concord. It's trying to predict what the weather is going to be like. And because they're hugging, it means that the weather for December is actually going to be very warm and nice. It's not overly scientific, but it's quite nice. Okay, so what do we do with a couple? Well, initially, an invitation was sent out to the office in King County in Seattle, saying, would couples applying for a marriage license like to take part in the scientific experiment? And so they would come. If they did, then they came, stayed for a weekend in the apartment to overlook Lake Washington. And the only thing they had to do was they had to have a problem of contention. Money, food, sex, children, in-laws, housing made absolutely no difference. They just had to, it had to be a problem that they didn't agree with. And so what we did was we took a video of them discussing this. So they sat opposite each other, and it's quite funny, and they were viewed through a one-way mirror, and it was very interesting. Within about 2 minutes, when the discussion got quite heated, they had totally forgotten that they're being videoed. They knew it, but they kind of...
How you know?
Pardon?
How do you know that?
Oh, just listening and watching them. It was this sort of... They weren't allowed to really hit each other. But anyway, and so we had a scoring system, which I'll describe in just a second. And behind this one-way mirror, there were some graduate students who scored what the wife said, or it was just before they were going to get married, some of the couples. And then the scores, when they said something positive and then something negative, these two scores were subtracted, and you got one for the husband and one for the wife. And so what it does, it measures the kind of positivity of them. And we used what's called specific effects coding system, and that is, it's a very simple one. And this is what really surprised me. Well, it surprised all of us, is these, if, for example, the wife says something and shows affection or humor, it was +4. On the scale, there were only integers, and it only went from +4 to -4. Contempt is the worst one. And then you had a whole lot of these things. What was surprising was how they weren't exactly the same, but how really, as a first approximation, all these students came up with the same answers. They wrote it all down. And then what we did is you get a kind of Dow Jones graph of the conversation. And this is what you get for the husband and what you get for the wife. So these are real numbers for a real couple. And we never interviewed them. We never talked to them. And we certainly didn't tell them what the predictions are. Well, they wouldn't have believed it anyway. And so this shows that as the discussion went on, it kept going up and down. But this is generally going up. So this actually is a fairly stable marriage. And then if you look at this one, that's the origin. And in fact, then it's when you look at that, each time they speak, it was roughly 0.8 positive to 1 negative. And so this really is a fairly unstable marriage. In fact, this couple did get divorced. And these are just turns of speech. And they talked for, it was roughly about 15 minutes. And so, because they didn't talk very long, I mean, sometimes be 10 seconds or so. And so this is the data. Well, we took a large number of newly married, or people going to get married, couples. And so it's not a small number, and we don't use statistics. We actually count them. So it's not, the usual thing, the problem with statistics. Sorry, that's just showing my background. And so we used the model to analyze the 15-minute thing. We then made predictions. That was the data. We then had to make a model. We made a model, and then we made the predictions of whether they would get divorced, stay married, either happily or unhappily. We then followed them every 1 to 2 years for up until about, it must have been about 8 to 10 years. And we sent them a questionnaire, and it was just sort of following up, and it was quite surprising. And the predictions of which couple would get divorced was 94%. That actually is not as good as it was, because the couples that we said are going to get divorced, we were 100% correct. The couples that we said would, probably stay married but unhappily, a lot of them got divorced. And so but even with that change... How many killings? Fun? Well, actually, there was one couple, and to begin with, we used to measure the blood pressure. And the man's blood pressure, as the conversation got more and more heated, his blood pressure went down. I mean, really, he just scared me silly. And the wife was, I can't remember her blood pressure, but I said, well, where did they meet? And John Gottman said, oh, they met in the paddy wagon going to prison. And so they really were, they were really pretty scary. Anyway, so that's really the statistics. But then the question is, what do you do the model? And so this is an example, because this is used for marital therapy now by the psychologist, and he now talks about people to other psychologists around America. So it's used, but to try and explain, so when a couple wants therapy, it comes, they then do exactly the same as the other couple, and then the conversation is analyzed, then the prediction is made, and then it's explained to them. And so what I'm just going to show, and this was used, these are two actors. So if the data lies in this quadrant, then they're both happy, and if it's in the third quadrant, they're both they're feeling miserable. And then this is why the woman is happy, and so she's unhappy. Then what one gets is, this is an example of a data of one specific couple. It should. And so these are the numbers that the conversation is giving over a period of 15 minutes. And as you see, it's all over the place. After a while, when you look at this data, when I first looked at it, I thought, how are we going to get anything out of this? But now when I look at it, actually most of it is kind of in the third quadrant. In other words, they're not getting on too well. So let me now talk about the model briefly. The mathematics is roughly high school stuff. But basically what we said is T is the time the wife or the husband speaks. So it just goes up in ones. So if the husband speaks, he has an influence on his wife. And then it's how the wife, if she was, mad as hell before, then, this is a term that can have an effect of how she replies. This term is, in a sense, what she brings to the marriage. And I don't want to go into that too much, but then there's another one for the husband. And then if you just write the equations and say, this is the number that the wife, that when she spoke at time t, that's the score she got. It could be 15, it could be -6 or whatever. And so this equation just says, there is the influence that the husband has on the wife. This R, this is a parameter that shows how really flexible she is. So if R is near 1, and mathematically, of course, there's this kind of equation, it has to be between nothing and 1, less than 1. And so if R is near 1, it means that she's not prepared to change her mind very easily. This parameter I'll talk about in just a second. So you get the same. And so really, in a sense, we've got the data. This is a model. So what are the parameter values and the influence function that gives the solution that we know? So it's like taking a quadratic equation and saying, look, the solution of the quadratic equation are 2 and -3. What's the equation that it came from? And all right, that one's an easy one, but it's exactly the same as here. It's just a little more complicated. And this is what was the key thing. It was how each of them influences the other. So this is typical data. And so what you do is you do a best fit and you fit the data. But that's much too complicated. Not only that, this is a very peculiar phenomenon. If the husband, in the discussion, here the husband's being positive, and his influence on the wife is positive, and so you get a kind of straight line. Then if he's too positive, the wife starts thinking, what's he getting at? And so she becomes kind of negative. And I thought, that's totally ridiculous. It turns out that that is actually very common. And with the data, not only that, if he becomes too negative, then the influence on the wife, she wants to get out of this mess, and so she then reacts more positively. Well, that's far too complicated. So we thought what we'll do is we'll just take the thing around, as the influence function as two straight lines. Right? And so we do a best fit near the origin until it starts to become more complicated. And this is a typical example of couple 1, which is the couple that I showed the conversation of. And these are it's the wife and the husband. So then we've got these straight lines. It's not as neat as the schematic one. And what we found was there are only 5 different types of marriage. And the marriages are classified according to the influence function, which was really, I mean, now it makes sense. But in this case, for example, if the husband says something positive, his influence on the wife is positive. If he says something negative, the influence on the wife isn't as negative. She responds less negatively. So this is one type of influence function, and this turns out to be one type of marriage. And in fact, this is a conflict-avoiding husband. This is the influence that the wife has on the husband. If she says something, then the influence is positive. If she says something negative, then it doesn't have a more negative effect on the husband. He doesn't react. And in the same way, this is a conflict-avoiding wife. And so what you have then is a kind of theoretical curve, influence function, which is like that, and then you just take it as 0 in the back. So that's one type of marriage. And that is that they have little effect on each other on the negative range. Okay. So these 5 types of marriages turn out to be classified them this way. And the volatile ones, they have, in this 15 minutes, they had all wild, sort of fights, arguments and everything, and then one of them will say something funny, and I mean, they're the kind of volatiles. That's a pretty, it can be stable or unstable. Validators are the couple where, I mean, if the husband says that, well, your mother can be such a tedious bore. I mean, and look at the food she gives us. And the wife will say, well, yeah, you're probably right. And so these are the validators. The avoiders are the ones that I just described. They don't want to have discussions, heated discussions in the negative range. The unstable marriages are the hostile ones, or the hostile detached. And these are the 5 types. The volatile one can be stable or unstable marriages. And you can read it, the heated arguments, cycles of fights, sex, etc. Validating, it's a much more companionate marriage. The avoiders is where they avoid confrontation and conflict. They don't want to have this in their marriage. The other unstable one is a conflict-avoiding wife, or the opposite, where she just doesn't want to get into an argument, or vice versa with the husband. And then this hostile detached is that the husband wants to have a discussion and the wife doesn't want to do it. She wants to avoid it all. And that's when she will kind of tend to agree. And so out of these 700 couples, we really were surprised these were the only types that seemed to come out of it. And so one can just do a tiny little bit of algebra before I finish. That's just the model again. If they don't, there are parts in the conversation where they don't have any influence on each other. And if that's the case, then you just end up with a single equation. And if you say it's got a steady state, you shove it into that equation and you solve it. And so you find that the uninfluenced steady state has got this parameter A in it. And as I said, R1 is less than 1. You get the same for the husband. And so what we found was that if A is negative and B is negative, they're going to get divorced. And so one uninfluenced function must be positive for the marriage to survive. So for the kind of more mathematical people, one can take these original equations and look at the null clines. And the null clines are really happy marriage, and so you get the French view of a happy marriage, you tramp grapes and things like that. But if the husband starts to get a bit negative, then you can see how the effect of the steady state of the marriage starts to go down. If the husband becomes even more negative, then there's no steady state. And it's this orgy of mutual satisfaction or some kind of Calvinistic hell that you see in various pictures. And so what you get is a qualitative behavior of the effect of your attitude towards the marriage. This turns out to be a key element in the clinical therapy. And so it's pointed out to them, look, you're just kind of negative. Why don't you try and be a bit more positive? And because it's this sort of thing, you can do it all with pictures. And this has proved immensely successful, this clinical therapy. And so this is just an example of a more realistic sort of null cline. And so if they interact in the positive quadrant, it's a stable, happy marriage. And then, it doesn't matter where they start the conversation, it always ends up in the positive quadrant. And so one sees a lot of the data that starts negative, but it always ends up like that. And so, on the other hand, if they have their steady states in the third quadrant, it doesn't matter where they start, they always end up being very negative. So that's the couple. Turns out that's where their steady state was, that it's negative, and in fact, as I said, that couple ended up getting divorced. And that was just the null clines. And it's not a case for therapy because they're both negative. And that marriage didn't have a high probability. They actually got divorced. And then if you look at this is, the husband is feeling negative, but the wife is still trying to be positive about it. And in fact, that actually is really a case for therapy. And this couple actually did have therapy, and that was roughly 1999. And by 2004, they were still married, and they had 2 children, and I think they're still married. This was the score, the Dow Jones thing of that couple before therapy. And you can see it starts to, and that's the wife, and it just becomes pretty negative. Then, after therapy, they did the conversation, and that's where the steady state was. And then we did the Dow Jones thing. It might not be joke a minute, but it's really, the husband is feeling much more positive, and the wife is not totally negative. And as I said, this is a couple that actually had successful therapy. Okay, so what have we gained? Just to finish up. The thing is that depending on the data suggests the repair scenario. The therapy has shown everything, as I said, and they're told how to repair it, how they might be able to repair it. This therapy was started in '98, and the thing is, even if they don't divorce, one can predict, in a sense, the subsequent, how they feel about the marriage. Okay, and it's a new language, and I just think that the social sciences is where modeling could really sort of make a major impact. It's still a very, it's in its infancy. People are interested in how people make decisions, how they interact. And there's a lot of work going on in Princeton, schools of fish. And it's really very interesting how a lot of these decisions are made. With couples, nobody wants to believe that one's emotional interaction can be quantified in 3 terms in an equation. And, but it can. Anyway, so this concept of 5 types of marriages was something that really surprised us. Stable marriages seem to have matched interaction styles, and unstable ones are mismatched. The thing about divorce is, because there's a lot of international marriages now, if people are going to get divorced, it is absolutely crucial which country you get it in. If you're a man, you go to Texas. If you're a woman, you go to France. But you don't get subsistence forever. And then the husband has to have been having an affair. There are some countries where the man can get a divorce without the wife even knowing about it. And so there is a huge number of lawyers now who specialize in international divorces. I mean, it's like all lawyers. You know, you look for the main, well, never mind.
The audience as well.
Yes. I thought my approach, and I'm sure Philip would agree, one wants to be practical. Michel de Montaigne is somebody that I've enjoyed reading for I don't know how long. And this is his view of, I think in a sense, my view of modeling. That really, you know, if you can't prove theorems, who cares? You know, and you might as well light a candle really to St. Michael and another to his dragon if it's going to help. And this picture, all the pictures of Montaigne have all got him, he's bald and he's got a beard, etc. And at dinner one night in college in Oxford, the librarian, Bodleian librarian, was at dinner. I said, you know, all I see is of Montaigne, he's always looking about 50, and he died about 57. He said, I've got a better picture. And this is a painting that is in the librarian's office in the Bodleian library, and it shows Montaigne in a much more human way. The other approach to mathematics is really about Auguste Comte, and this is when he lived, and this is his view about mathematics and biology. And you can just see in mathematics we find the primitive source of rationality, and mathematicians must, the biologists must resort to them for any way to carry out their researches. That's how you make friends, isn't it? Well, that sort of arrogance, a friend in Australia sent me that picture. And I just thought that the stock really kind of signified to me the kind of pure mathematician. And he sent it to me because I did quite a lot of work on alligator survival, because the sex is determined in a peculiar way that lets them survive. And then I had this, and I wrote to him and said, can I use it in a lecture? And he said, oh, I don't remember ever taking it. He said, but you might want to see this one, which might be a better reaction. And so I think that's maybe a good place to stop. But what I wanted to just show is that really the modeling, you can get all sorts of information from simple models. And so maybe I should have called it on virtues of simple models or something. It doesn't get you credit among the mathematicians, but since I started off as a pure mathematician and then saw the light, I can take that stand. And certainly the problems that one can work on are just unbelievably diverse. And with social sciences and medicine coming into it, I think the whole field that's the most exciting thing. And if Philip doesn't mind, I got sent a paper on topology. And I couldn't understand the title, so I sent it to Philip, and I said, what do you think of this? I said, there's probably not 7 people in the world who will read it. Philip emailed back and said, that many? So, a good place to talk. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions? Do you have questions?
Have you published the last results on the marriage?
Pardon?
And publication with your last results on marriage?
Yeah, we actually, we published it in a bad book. And we published a few papers. I can send you the references. The book was written by a few of my students and John Gottman, and multiple other books.
Actually, you videotape the couples, right? You videotape the couples, and there are two ways to do it. One with words, and one without words. I mean, you see the gesture.
So
with words. I mean,
Yes.
you record what they are saying.
Yes.
Or you just see the way they behave. You know?
Ah, no.
No.
Just words.
Just words.
Just words.
Okay.
Yes. And I must admit, looking at some of the movies, I thought, God, she should get rid of him now. You know, but we had to rely on the science side. Yeah.
All right.
But,
Any more questions?
I saw your talk about the wedding marriage stuff a little while ago, and someone in the audience asked you about sport, betting, about two teams interacting with each other, and you mentioned that you've been approached by some gambling firms.
yes.
And I just wondered if that has actually been carried on.
No, I didn't follow it up. No, I didn't know.
A lot of money is involved.
Exactly.
That's the danger.
Yeah, regarding your research on marriage, I guess a whole new approach, well, it's not a new, I mean the usual approach might be dealing with game theory, for instance. Because in marriage I can think of that both are playing a game like in a prisoner dilemma, and many mathematicians are applying in this kind of. What's your opinion on this, or have you tried or think about it in terms of game theory?
Well, we did talk about that at one time. I just thought it was much less exact, and there was much more value judgment, personal value judgment coming into it. With this approach, it really, there wasn't any value judgment. We never talked to them. And we just, it seemed to work, and you quit when you're ahead, sort of thing. But no, game theory is certainly another approach, but I haven't heard really any data about that, so I don't know how it's worked, and I certainly haven't been involved. But it is another approach.
Yes, another way is just to include statistics, because I mean there's a lot of statistics in broken marriages and about the causes of broken marriages. So I was surprised to know that you didn't have to bring sex with a third party to the equation, but which is actually very influential.
Well, actually, in France, there was a psychologist who also deals with marriage, and she wrote a book, and I don't know how many of you speak French. She said every time I met her, every time, and she talked to the woman, and they talked together, and then eventually the woman would say, c'était cette chose-là, which was sex. So this psychologist wrote a book called Cette chose-là. And she analyzed them, but she did it personally by talking to them, and she tended to talk only to the wife. But I think statistics, I worry about statistics. Well, that's what Kelvin says. If you need statistics, you didn't do the right experiments. Which was no, that's a very old view.
Any more questions? Not about marriages, but I mean about fish or brain tumors.
Brain tumor thing. Again, I saw it a while ago. Someone asked in the audience a question. I can't remember the answer. Well, I'd love to remember the answer. Someone asked if you had a brain tumor, God forbid, and you modelled it and it said you needed to cut out this much, and the surgeon said, "Oh, I'm going to cut only this much." Would you trust your model?
Absolutely. Yes. No. I wouldn't trust brains. No, never mind. No, I think they just want to cut things out. And it's really, I mean, that's their business. And I find that science, the medical people, Philip would agree, they're not always receptive. And particularly in Scotland, they have a God complex. And it's amazing that it survives, but it does. So they really, to work with medics who really are interested in modeling, it's a very exciting field. And in this case, Buster Alvor was the one who approached me. I didn't think about it. And he was immensely practical and arranged for all sorts of things, mainly autopsies and biopsies, and invited me to autopsies, which I passed. But no, that was really absolutely crucial.
The only mathematics that surgeons have is statistics. When
Money.
you're well, this is another parameter.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you're a cancer patient, I mean, you'll become a part of the statistics and your chances of survival and all that. Yeah. But I mean, the main cause of cancer is going to the doctor. And actually, that deforms the statistics, because you go to the doctor, he diagnoses you with cancer. You don't have cancer, but he says you do, and they treat you, and you become a positive. And then the whole business is
there's a lot of that.
very nice,
Yes.
very, very nice. So it's a very good question. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Entendí más o menos porque está hablando en inglés, pero en realidad entonces el esposo es el que tiene como un poquito más de influencia en la relación, y eso igual se calculó matemáticamente o
al
estoy
revés.
perdida.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah, she's telling that her English is not very good, that's why she
Yes,
couldn't
I don't know,
catch.
sorry.
If
Sorry.
it was actually the husband's fault,
What?
the husband's
Yes.
fault, I mean, being more sensitive to the thing, on the changes in the marriage, or she didn't got it right, probably.
I don't know. In a sense, these are refinements that we didn't put into any modeling, but I think it can be made more sophisticated. But at the moment, well, I gave up. We left Seattle, and I think there's still quite a bit of work to be done. In fact, there was some work done on gay marriages,
Oh,
which, it turned out to be really quite different.
oh yes, of course.
And just how they interacted and discussed. And the results just were quite surprising, but the
Yes.
predictions were just the same.
I used to have a friend who hated homosexuals because said, you combine the force of a man with the bad feelings of a woman, he said.
Well, actually, what Montaigne said is the perfect marriage is actually to have a deaf husband and a blind wife.
Exactly. Okay, we thank Jim again, and we go on.